Hi, everyone. Really pleased to introduce my next speaker, Paul Markwick. Paul is a global tectonics expert, a field which he's studied for well over 30 years. I'll not give the exact number away, and published extensively on the subject. He is responsible for Project InnerSpace's tectonic map of the world. So I'm going to hand it straight over to Paul to provide us with some of the amazing and beautiful features that they're collating in the tectonic map. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Helen. And thanks for the reminder of the 30 years. So I'm working with Douglas Payton and his teams in Scotland, New Mexico, and China to build the global tectonic map of the world as part of this global mapping project. Now, this tectonic map comprises three main elements: structural, folds and faults, igneous activity, which is volcanoes and lava flows, but also intrusions, things like granites, and what we're calling the crustal facies, which includes a representation of the crustal thickness and its composition. Now, this draws on over 30 years of building similar databases for hydrocarbon and mineral exploration. It also builds on the last 6 years of research where Douglas and I have gone back to refine these methodologies. And this started with a project on East Africa, which was published back in 2021. And if you'd like to know more about the methodologies, this is open access and you can download it for free. Question, of course, is why is this sort of information important for geothermal? And this is something that's been discussed, I'm sure, over the last 2 weeks. For me, it's about heat flow and generating heat, and of course, fluid flow. And in this, we can look at different elements of tectonics and how they affect both of those components. So, for example, faults act as conduits and barriers to fluid flow. And this is a function of the damage zone, how wide it is. It's a function of how deep the fault goes, but also the response of each of the faults to, for example, the stress field, whether the faults are opening and allowing fluid flow along the fault, or whether they are closing where they can form a barrier. Igneous activity is probably easier to understand in terms of geothermal. We can think of Iceland and Japan and direct sources of heat. And so that's one of the reasons we've mapped out volcanic activity. But heat can also be generated through intrusions, especially granites and the minerals they contain, with the decay of radiogenic isotopes, especially thorium, uranium, and potassium. And so again, we've mapped out granites and other intrusions as part of this mapping. Other igneous features like igneous dikes and sills, again, act as barriers to fluid flow, so we've tried to capture that information where we can. But also capturing the bigger picture, the tectonic setting, because each of the tectonic settings has its own heat flow, its own structural and igneous signature, and that can affect geothermal potential. And in the bottom left here of this slide is an image from Joly et al.'s paper from 2021, looking at what they refer to as power generation potential, and each of those boxes is a different tectonic regime, showing how the potential changes depending on where you're looking. Now, in reality, of course, the situation is much more complex. And so our role here is to provide a baseline suite of databases to enable us to high-grade areas for more detailed investigation. So how are we doing that? Well, I mentioned that with this sort of building on methodologies we've been researching over the last 5-10 years, and it includes using primary data sets and secondary data. Now, the primary data sets include data sets such as Landsat and radar data, gravity magnetics, and seismic data that you'll be familiar with. These are used to generate the interpretations. These are our primary source. And one thing I want to stress here is we're not simply copying other people's interpretations. We're using them to help us, but we're going right back to the original data in order to build a more robust data set. On the right-hand side is the secondary data. This includes things such as geological maps and publications. And this information is used to provide additional information for our interpretations. The age of activity, the nature of the fault. Is it an extensional fault or is it a compressional fault? So that helps us better constrain and add information to the databases. In the middle here, we have the workflow. And I realize that you probably won't be able to read all of the details here. But essentially, we take that input data, and the first of our databases we build, which is in dark green here, is the structural elements database. That's where we start. And then once we have that in place, we add the igneous features and the crustal features as well, because they both need to have the structures in place. The other green boxes there are other databases that relate to the main databases and help us better constrain these. But one of the key parts of this, as Helen mentioned in her introduction, is to ensure that you can trust the database and the interpretations that are within it. And so one of the major efforts that we've gone into here is to provide a very detailed audit trail so that every single structure, every single igneous feature we map, you know what it's based on, how reliable we think it is, and the references behind it. Now, in our own working environment, we can actually link the databases to papers and key figures, as you see on the left. In the databases themselves, these are summarized into attribute tables. And this sort of table here is just one part of the structural database table. Key thing to get out of this is that probably half of the attributes are about the geology, but the other half, the other 50%, include information on an explanation of why we drew the feature where we did, what it's based on. Is it gravity or Landsat? How reliable is it? And we'll come back to that with the example in a little while. Now, mapping the whole world, of course, is a big place. And so we've broken this up into different areas, again, as Helen was outlining at the beginning. Starting here with stage one, with looking at Africa. And what I thought here was to just quickly run through some examples of the databases and the datasets beneath them, using an example from the Hogar Massif in the Central Sahara. Now, you may wonder, as you're exploring for geothermal, why I'm choosing Hogar. Well, it does appear to be, for people such as myself, in the middle of nowhere. Well, that's actually the reason for choosing it, because it's an area with limited data. It has very little exploration history in terms of the hydrocarbon industry, which means we don't have that seismic background and other resources. So it's a great place to test out what we can do in an area that is geologically complex and with limited data. So what I'm going to do is run through a series of slides that show you how we build the databases and what they look like. Now, on the left-hand side here is the location map. That'll stay up so you can see exactly where we are. And we're starting with elevation here. And elevation gives us the highs you can see in terms of the Hogar Mountains themselves, and we can pick out a little bit of some linear features. And what we do is to take that, using remote sensing techniques, such as using a slope derivative in this particular case, very simple, and we can start to pick out more linear features and also fabrics within here, which are the underlying geological fabric. There's a response of the different rock types to erosion and weathering. And we can see faults cutting that. If you look at the middle of the picture towards the right-hand side, you might be able to pick that out with a northeast-southwest orientated series of faults. We can go into more detail with Landsat. This example here, again, it gives us higher resolution. But in this image, you can start to see these darker areas, which are the volcanics, the lavas, the volcanic cones, and the volcanic fields. And again, what we're going to do is draw around those, put those into the database, go to the literature, go to existing work to look at ages and petrology, and add that to our data set. And then deeper in the crust, we're looking at gravity and magnetics. This is a magnetic data set from Bornas et al. In 2007. We do have higher resolution data, but this coarser resolution is great for defining the terrains and the crustal scale blocks that determine the overall composition and thickness of the crust. So we have the inputs, and here are the databases. So this is the structural database for this region. You can see that we've got some strike slip faults with the arrows. We have some compressional features that are indicated by the triangles as markers, and then a lot of faults where they're simply lines and we're not quite sure what they are. You may also notice that there is a line weighting difference here as well, and the line weighting reflects how deep in the crust the feature seems to go. And this is important in terms of geothermal as to whether we're just looking at superficial structures or whether we are looking here at crustal scale. But we can do more than that, because with the attributes and the audit trail, we can look at mapping confidence, for example. How well placed geometrically in space are the features we've drawn? And this goes from 5 in this very simple scheme, which is no changes expected in the position, to red, which is very much have a coffee and get help. And so this is about visualizing uncertainty, but it means in exploration, we can work out where we should go to, or where we need more detailed information. With the structure in place, we can look at the crustal facies. Now, in this particular area, we're looking at crust that's about 30-35 kilometers thick. There is a little variability. And the classification here takes both the thickness and the composition. And the different colors here reflect different compositions, large-scale compositions in the crustal blocks, these terrains here. Are they based on ocean arcs or continent-continent collision? And that can affect heat flow. And then finally putting on the igneous features. And here in the light pinks, you can see the intrusions, the granites of different compositions, and in the greens, the different forms of igneous activity. Is it a lava flow? Is it a volcanic field? And of course, within the database, we have the names of the features, we have the ages, which we can add. And now we have, I think you'll agree, quite a detailed, complicated series of databases and a representation of this area. An area which I began with saying seems to be in the middle of nowhere. And so what have we built here, or what are we building over the next year or so, is a suite of global tectonic databases to provide a baseline resource for geothermal exploration, starting with Africa. It is built to industry standards based on our experience in exploration over 30 years. It's defined on primary data, but supported by secondary sources, bringing in those other databases. And it's underpinned by a comprehensive audit trail, so we know where the data comes from. It's also, of course, open access, as Helen said in her introduction, which is key because it enables the community and industry and academia to accelerate geothermal exploration, and from that, the energy transition. So with that, my thanks to Project InnerSpace for supporting the project. And if you're interested in contributing data or would like to talk to us further about it, please contact myself or Helen, and we'll be very happy to talk to you. Thanks very much.